In October 1852, on a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a pregnant black woman was beaten to death in open view, and the man who killed her expected the yard to go silent and stay silent. That is where this record must begin. Not with the lies told later by white newspapers, not with the courtroom language that always softened murder into discipline, not with the old plantation excuse that cruelty was necessary to preserve order. No, it began the way slavery always revealed itself when it felt challenged, with public violence, with ownership spoken aloud, with a white man deciding that a black woman's body was his to strike, her child his to claim, and her life his to end. Her name, in this telling, is Hannah Reed. She was about 26 years old. She was several months pregnant. She was known across the quarters not only as a field hand's wife, but as a healer, a midwife, a woman people trusted when fever came, when births turned dangerous, when a child stopped breathing right in the middle of the night. Men like Julian Laroo, master of the plantation, liked to think such women existed merely to patch up the damage slavery caused. But women like Hannah often carried something more dangerous than herbs or cloth bandages. They carried memory. They carried messages. They carried the quiet intelligence that slave society always pretended black people did not possess. Before dawn that morning, Hannah was still in the cabin with her husband, Elias Reed. Outside, the fog sat low over the cane fields. Inside, there was the usual poverty of the enslaved quarters: rough boards, damp air, thin blankets, tired bodies rising too early for another day that did not belong to them. And still, in that place designed to grind people down to labor in silence, there remained something slaveholders could never fully control. A hand laid across a pregnant belly, a whispered warning, a promise to return before dark, a small act of care in a world built to deny care. That matters. It must be said plainly, because slavery did not only steal labor, it tried to erase tenderness itself. It tried to make brutality seem ordinary and affection seem irrelevant. The record must resist that lie. Hannah had been out late the night before, tending to a sick boy from another cabin. That should have been enough explanation for any human being, but Julian Laroo was not interested in explanation. Men like him rarely were. What they demanded was submission dressed up as obedience. What they feared was not disobedience alone, but any sign that the people they claimed to own still possessed judgment, still made choices, still moved according to a moral law above the plantation bell. At first light, the enslaved workers were gathered for roll call. The overseer stood with his ledger. Names were spoken. Bodies were counted. That, too, was part of the crime. Slavery reduced human existence to inventory before breakfast. Then Laroo stepped forward. Pressed coat, clean boots. No sign of doubt. The kind of man white society liked to call respectable, so long as the blood he spilled belonged to black people. He called Hannah out in front of everyone and demanded to know where she had been the night before. Hannah answered steadily. She had been treating a child with fever. She had gone because the boy's mother begged for help. That should have ended it. It did not end it because this was not an inquiry. It was an accusation staged as a warning. Laroo said she had left her quarters without permission. He said she was lying. He said he believed she had been plotting something. And there, in a single moment, the plantation exposed its own anxiety. White power in the slave South was never as calm as it pretended. It suspected what it had earned. It knew that wherever the enslaved shared information, comforted one another, moved between cabins after dark, helped the sick, buried the dead, or remembered older rebellions, something larger than fear might be forming. Hannah did not shout. She did not provoke him. She did what countless black women under slavery were forced to do. She spoke carefully in the hope that truth, humility, and visible pregnancy might restrain a violent man. It did not. Laroo struck her across the face. The sound carried through the yard. Elias moved instinctively because he was her husband, and because there are moments when the body tries to do what the law forbids, but other hands seized him before he could reach her. That is another thing slavery depended on, not just the violence of the master, but the organized immobilization of every witness. The husband restrained. The crowd frozen, the overseer watching, the lesson made public. Then Laroo struck her again and again. Hannah fell, folding around her belly, trying to protect the child inside her from a world that had already declared both mother and unborn baby property. Laroo said the quiet part aloud. The baby was his too, he claimed. Everything on that plantation was his, every breath. Every hour, every body, that is the language of slavery when stripped of all ornament. Not paternalism, not civilization. Not stewardship, ownership of flesh, ownership of pregnancy, Ownership claimed so completely that murder could be delivered in broad daylight and still be described by the killer as discipline. By the time Laroo stepped back, Hannah was on the ground and dying. He told the people gathered there to treat it as a lesson. That phrase should be remembered, not because it was unusual, but because it was common. Slave society always wanted its crimes to become curriculum. Every whipping was meant to instruct. Every sale was meant to instruct. Every family torn apart at auction was meant to instruct. And on that morning in October 1852, the death of a pregnant woman in the dirt was also meant to instruct. Do not move without permission. Do not care for one another beyond what the master allows. Do not create loyalties deeper than the plantation. Do not imagine a moral world outside white command. And above all, do not let the dead become evidence. But evidence does not disappear because a killer walks away. Hannah died after sunrise with blood at her mouth as the fog thinned off the fields. The people around her could do almost nothing except witness, and witnessing mattered. In a slave regime, witness was one of the last forms of truth left to the powerless. The white court might never indict Julian Laroo. The parish might never name the crime correctly. The law might never record Hannah as murdered, but the people in that yard saw what happened. They knew what was done. They knew he killed her. That evening, they buried her behind the quarters. No marble stone, no proper marker, no legal recognition, just turned earth, rough hands, exhausted grief, and the kind of burial enslaved people gave one another because the world above them refused dignity and the people below still insisted on it anyway. Elias dug the grave himself. The dead under slavery were often pushed quickly into the ground, as if haste could hide the shame of the living order above them. But the grave behind the quarters was never just a burial place. It was an archive without paper, a field of stolen names, a ledger the plantation could not read. Every mound of dirt testified that someone had lived, suffered, resisted, loved, and been denied justice. That night, after the others drifted away, Elias remained beside Hannah's grave. And this is where the story turns. Because Julian Laroo believed he had ended a problem before noon. He believed he had crushed a woman, terrorized the quarters, and restored the plantation's order with his bare hands. That was the arrogance slavery trained into men like him. They mistook immediate silence for permanent control. They mistook fear for loyalty. They mistook the burial of one black woman for the burial of everything she knew. But the dead are often more dangerous to tyranny than the living, especially when they leave something behind. Elias knelt in the dark beside the fresh earth, blaming himself the way grieving men often do when the true guilt belongs elsewhere. But guilt must be assigned correctly. Let the record be disciplined here. Hannah Reed did not die because her husband failed. She died because slavery authorized a white man to treat black life as disposable. She died because the plantation system in Louisiana in 1852 was not malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as designed, and yet design can be studied. Systems can be exposed. Power can overreach. Murder can become a trigger. Because before that grave cooled, before Julian Laroo had finished congratulating himself on restoring order, the thing he feared most was already moving beneath the surface. Not grief alone, not anger alone, but structure. And by the next night, that structure would begin to reveal itself. If you're listening from somewhere in the world tonight, comment your city, state, or country below because Hannah's story was meant to be buried in Louisiana in 1852, and every voice naming this place now is one more witness the plantation never planned for. In the hours after Hannah Reed was buried in October 1852, the Laroo plantation did what slave plantations always tried to do after open brutality. It pretended the matter was finished. That is one of the oldest lies in the record. A white man kills. A black woman is lowered into shallow ground behind the quarters. The overseers return to their rounds. The cane still waits in the field. The mill still turns. The ledger still counts bodies as labor and losses as expense. And the crime is expected to disappear into routine, as if routine itself were not part of the crime. But routine failed that night. Elias Reed remained at the grave long after the others left. The hymn had ended. The whispered prayers had thinned out. The air had cooled. What stayed with him was not comfort. It was the raw, punishing fact that his wife had been beaten to death in public and that no white authority on that plantation would name it murder. That must be said clearly. Not an incident. Not punishment. Not discipline carried too far. Murder. The system called it order because the system was built by the guilty. Elias pressed both hands into the fresh dirt. as if grief could still reach through cloth and soil. He blamed himself because slavery trained the enslaved to carry guilt that belonged to their owners. That is another theft the institution committed. It did not merely take labor. It distorted blame. It forced husbands to think they had failed when armed men restrained them. It forced mothers to think they had failed when their children were sold. It forced entire communities to internalize crimes designed elsewhere. Then his fingers touched something that should not have been there. A small cloth pouch had been tucked into the folds of Hannah's burial wrapping. Not dropped by accident, not hidden in panic, placed there. Meant to be found by the right hands if the worst happened. That detail matters, because the turn in this story does not come from luck. It comes from preparation. Hannah Reed had already accounted for disaster. She had already assumed that the plantation could take her life before it understood what she was doing. That is how serious she had been. That is how far ahead she had been thinking, while Julian Laroo was still imagining himself master of all outcomes. Elias did not open the pouch by the grave. He understood enough to know that open sorrow could be watched. Even mourning under slavery had to be calculated. He carried the pouch to the back of a storage shed, keeping to the darkest edge of the yard, and opened it under thin moonlight with no lamp, no witness, and no margin for error. Inside were papers, not one or two scraps, several. Some were marked with symbols Elias did not immediately understand, circles crossed by lines, triangles turned at different angles, small crosses, repeated marks arranged in patterns too deliberate to be random. This was not devotional writing, not household reckoning, not anything a plantation owner would dismiss as harmless woman's work. This was coded structure. Then came the sketches. Crude, yes, but clear enough. The Laroo plantation itself. The Morrison place about 3 miles east. Beaumont to the north. The old Duchamp tract near the river road. Storage houses. Slave quarters. Paths between fields. Creek edges. Wagon tracks. Narrow routes that did not follow the main roads. Then the names. Some Elias knew, some he did not. A woman from Beaumont with kin on Laroo land, a produce boy from Morrison who came through often enough to avoid suspicion. A stable hand, a kitchen woman, men in the mill, women who moved between births and burials and therefore heard more than the master class ever guessed. Next to each name, another symbol. This is where the plantation myth begins to rot from the inside. Because slaveholders liked to imagine that black people on neighboring estates existed in isolation, cut off from one another except by chance. That fiction comforted white power. It was easier to rule people if one could believe they were fragmented, exhausted, incapable of sustained coordination. But Hannah's papers exposed the truth. The roads between plantations carried more than cotton and sugar. They carried rumor, warning, kinship, memory, instructions, and timing. In other words, intelligence. That word must be restored to the enslaved, intelligence. Not instinct, not vague defiance, not accidental unrest, deliberate, organized intelligence. Elias stared at the papers until the meaning became impossible to avoid. These were not escape notes for one couple planning to run north. This was not a grieving woman's private fantasy. This was infrastructure. A communication web reaching across multiple plantations in the parish. A system of contacts, signals, safe movement, and layered trust. And Hannah had built it while pregnant. That too belongs in the record. While carrying a child in a body already overworked by bondage, while tending the sick, while surviving surveillance, while sleeping beside a husband she did not fully brief for his own protection, she had spent years assembling the skeleton of a rebellion. Nia found him there before he had finished unfolding the last sheet. She did not gasp. She did not ask what he had found. She looked at the papers and understood at once. That tells you something else. Hannah had not worked entirely alone. Nia crouched beside him in the dark and spoke the truth plainly. Hannah had been building those routes for 3 years. Message lines, safe contacts, signal patterns, people who could pass word without drawing the eye of overseers. People who knew when to speak and when silence itself was part of the code. Elias asked the question most husbands would ask too late. Why had Hannah never told him all of it? Because under slavery, love and secrecy sometimes had to live in the same room. The less he knew, the safer he was if questioned, whipped, sold, or watched. That was not mistrust. That was operational discipline forced upon black life by white terror. Slave society made intimacy dangerous. It made knowledge punishable. It made even truth between husband and wife a thing to be measured against survival. Nia told him something else. Hannah had said the network was almost ready. Not complete, but close. A few more contacts, a few more confirmations, a little more time. Time she was not given. That is why Julian Laroo did more than kill a woman on that October morning in 1852. He triggered a timetable he did not know existed. He forced hidden work into sudden motion. He accelerated the very danger he imagined he had crushed. The quarters did not sleep that night. Elias could hear it through the cabin walls. Low voices, floorboards shifting, people awake with anger sharp in their throats. They had all seen Hannah beaten down in the yard. They had all seen Laroo walk away calling it a lesson. And anger, under slavery, was always treated as irrational by the powerful. But that was another lie. Anger in that place was evidence. Evidence that people still recognized evil when it stood over them in clean boots. Evidence that conscience had not been fully whipped out of the quarters. Then an older figure stepped from the dark. In this telling, his name is Josiah Cole, bent with age. One leg stiff from old punishment, eyes still bright with the kind of memory white men fear most. Memory that outlives their version of events. Josiah took one look at the papers and understood the lineage immediately. He reached into his shirt and pulled out an older cloth map, water-stained and worn by decades of hiding. On it were marks startlingly close to Hannah's code. He named the year without ceremony. 1811, the old German coast uprising. The rebellion slave Louisiana tried to half erase and half terrify people into remembering only his failure. Josiah had been young then. He had survived it. He had carried fragments of its planning for more than 40 years. That is how history really moves among the oppressed, not in official monuments, in scarred bodies, in whispered corrections, in maps folded under shirts, in old people whom the plantation assumes are broken because it cannot imagine that endurance is also a weapon. Josiah said the mistake in 1811 had been haste without enough coordination. Hannah had listened. Hannah had studied. Hannah had decided that the next attempt, whenever it came, would be more disciplined than the last. Organized, careful, connected. That was her method, not blind rage, not chaos, not fantasy, method. Outside, thunder gathered over the Louisiana sky. The air changed. Even before the first lightning strike, the whole plantation seemed to hold its breath. Elias sat between Hannah's hidden papers and Josiah's older map and finally understood the full cruelty of what had happened. Julian Laroo thought he had silenced one woman before the workday ended. But by nightfall, that dead woman was speaking through roots, symbols, names, and memory older than the plantation itself. And once a system like that is uncovered, routine can no longer contain it, not for long, because after the murder came the evidence, and after the evidence would come the decision. By dawn on October 18, 1852, the Laroo plantation was no longer running on discipline, it was running on panic. That difference matters. Slaveholders liked to describe their world as stable, orderly, protected by law and custom, but what they called order was usually just fear managed on a schedule. The bell rang, the bodies moved, the wagons rolled, the cane was cut, the ledger balanced. And from a distance the plantation looked permanent. But permanence built on terror is always thin. It only takes one visible crime, one murdered woman, one night of carried messages, to reveal how little trust was ever there. Julian Laroo did not understand that yet. He woke that morning believing he still controlled the tempo of events. He believed Hannah Reed was dead, Elias Reed was broken, and the quarters had absorbed the lesson. By breakfast, he was already planning the next layer of punishment. The traitor from St. Martin Parish was expected within days, perhaps sooner. A list had already been discussed. Elias's name was on it. 2 strong field hands from the West Row were on it. A teenage boy who had once been caught lingering near the road was on it. Sale was the plantation's preferred answer whenever fear failed. Separate the dangerous, scatter the witnesses. Convert defiance into cash. That too was slavery. Not only the whip, but the market. Not only cruelty, but liquidation. Inside the quarters, before first light had fully broken over the cane, Elias, Nia, and Josiah were already reading Hannah's papers again. Not as mourners, as operators. The transformation was immediate because it had to be. Grief remained, but grief under slavery rarely had the luxury of stillness. White violence forced decision faster than the heart could process burial. Hannah had been in the ground only a few hours, and already her hidden network had become the only map anyone could trust. The coded sheets were spread across a rough crate inside an unused tool shed. Nia traced the marks with her finger and translated them aloud. A circle with a cut on the left meant a watcher stationed near a wagon path. 2 short lines under a triangle meant food stored and ready. A cross beside a name meant someone reliable for messages but not for direct action. A square mark at the edge of a sketch meant a place where patrol patterns weakened after sunset. This was not improvisation. This was field intelligence. And what Hannah had prepared for late October had now been dragged forward by murder. Josiah said it plainly. If Laroo sold Elias, the chain would start breaking by noon. If the trader took even 2 or 3 people from the inner circle, the roots between plantations would fracture. Contacts would go silent. Suspicion would spread faster than messages. Hannah had built the network on timing, and Julian Laroo had forced time itself to collapse. That is often how power destroys itself. Not because it becomes merciful, but because it becomes arrogant enough to strike too hard, too publicly, too soon. So the plan changed. Not the objective. The timing. What had been intended for a later date, after more confirmation, after more signals, after more provisions, would now begin that same day. Not perfectly, not safely, but necessarily. This must be remembered without romantic foolishness. Uprisings by the enslaved were not born from carelessness. They were usually born from compression. There is a point at which waiting becomes surrender dressed up as patience. Hannah had understood that better than anyone. Her papers proved she had hoped to move with greater precision, but they also proved she knew the plantation might force an earlier reckoning. That is why alternate routes were marked. That is why duplicate contacts existed. That is why symbols, not names alone, carried the structure. She had planned for disruption because slavery was disruption. By sunrise, the first signal left the Laroo quarters. A washcloth tied in a specific fold on a fence post facing the Morrison Road, ordinary to white eyes, urgent to the right ones. Then another. A stable boy let a mule cart linger 2 minutes too long near the north path, enough for a passerby from Beaumont to notice the cloth tucked under the seat rail. A kitchen woman sent a basket back half full instead of empty. A girl carrying water paused by the cypress edge and hummed the final line of a church hymn twice instead of once. To the overseer, these would have looked like nothing. That is why slave systems were always more vulnerable than they seemed. Their rulers mistook illiteracy for ignorance, silence for emptiness, custom for obedience. Meanwhile, an entire language moved under their noses. By mid-morning, word had reached at least 3 neighboring plantations. Hannah is dead. The sale is coming. Move now. No slogans, no speeches, no theatrical declarations. Under conditions like these, clarity was mercy. On the Laroo place itself, the work gang was sent to the cane as usual. Laroo wanted normalcy displayed. It was an old tactic. After spectacular violence, insist on routine. Make the enslaved bend immediately back into labor, as though the body of a murdered pregnant woman behind the quarters could be absorbed like bad weather. But the field that morning was wrong. Too quiet in one row. Too many glances in another, tools pausing a fraction too long. Men angling themselves where they could see both the road and the tree line. Women passing near one another under the excuse of bundle exchange. Not disorder yet. Something more dangerous. Readiness. Elias was placed near the center gang, watched more closely than most. Laroo had ordered it. He suspected the husband might become a problem, though he still imagined the problem would be individual. That was his blindness. Slaveholders always personalized threats because they could not bear to admit the collective intelligence of the enslaved. They feared a difficult Negro, a defiant husband, a dangerous preacher, a troublesome woman. They rarely wanted to say the larger truth, that an entire laboring population had reason, memory, and accumulating cause. Around late morning, the first answer came from beyond Laroo land. A rider's whistle from the Morrison boundary, short, long. Short. Elias did not turn his head. Neither did Nia, who was carrying water between rows. But Josiah, stationed near the tool wagon, heard it and closed his eyes for 1 second as if measuring fate itself. Then came another sign. Smoke lifted where no cooking fire should have been, low and deliberate beyond the northern ditch. Not a blaze. A mark. Beaumont had received the message. And just like that, Hannah's hidden map ceased to be paper. It became movement. Laroo sensed it before he understood it. Men like him always felt the loss of control in the body first. He rode out from the house around noon with the overseer and 2 armed whites behind him, scanning the field as though suspicion alone could retake command. He stopped beside a row where 2 women had fallen behind schedule and demanded an explanation. One said her blade had dulled. It was a lie, but not the kind he knew how to read. The lie was buying minutes, not innocence. At the road, a wagon failed to arrive on time from the Morrison place. That was unusual enough to draw notice. Then a kitchen servant ran from the big house carrying word that the trader had sent ahead. He would arrive sooner than expected, possibly by the following morning. Laroo cursed openly. The sale list needed finalizing. Elias needed isolating. Shackles would be brought by evening. This is the point where many white accounts later tried to suggest the enslaved suddenly turned violent, as if events emerged from nowhere. The record should reject that lie. Nothing sudden was happening except the master's realization that his own violence had consequences. The sequence was plain. He beat a pregnant woman to death on October 17, 1852. That night, her hidden network was uncovered. By the morning of October 18th, a planned action had been forced forward by the threat of sale and dismemberment, cause and effect, crime and response. It should be told that way. Near midday, Nia passed close enough to Elias to murmur one sentence without looking at him. By sundown, they come. He kept cutting cane after she said it. That detail should be preserved because history often expects heroism to look like performance. Most real turning points do not. A man hears that several plantations are preparing to move, and he keeps his shoulders low and his blade working because survival, until the chosen minute, depends on looking ordinary. Then Josiah dropped a cane knife on purpose. The sound cut across the row, not dramatic, not loud enough to alarm the whole field, but placed precisely where 3 watchers could hear and understand. A signal disguised as clumsiness. From the south edge of Laroo land, 2 figures appeared where no authorized workers were scheduled to be. One carried a feed sack, the other had a hoe over his shoulder. To a white eye, laborers crossing ground. To the network, confirmed arrival. The Morrison men were in position. By 1 in the afternoon, word spread cabin to cabin, row to row, ditch to ditch, not with shouting. With pressure. With the tightening in the air before a storm breaks. Mothers quietly gathering children closer to the quarters. Men checking tool handles. Women shifting water buckets where they would be needed later. One old woman carrying strips of cloth for bandages before blood had even been drawn. That was Hannah's influence too. Revolt in her design was never just attack. It included care, supply, retreat, and survival. She had thought past the first blow. That is why Julian Laroo was already losing, though he still sat upright in the saddle, believing himself master of the field. He had killed the woman who understood the architecture of resistance better than anyone on his land. But he had killed her too late, because by the afternoon of October 18, 1852, the dead woman's schedule was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the living now. And before the sun went down, the plantations around Laroo would begin to answer. By late afternoon on October 18, 1852, the Laroo plantation was no longer a plantation in the old sense. It was a fault line. That is the language this moment deserves, not unrest. Not disturbance. Not an unfortunate breakdown of labor discipline, as white men later preferred to write in their parish records. A fault line. Because what split open that day was not only one estate in Louisiana, but the lie that slave order was natural, durable, and accepted by the people forced to live under it. The first break came near the north ditch just before sundown. 2 men from the Morrison place stepped out where field hands were not supposed to be. Then 3 more appeared behind them. Then a woman carrying a feed sack dropped it in the grass, and inside were not provisions for mules but strips of cloth, dried cornmeal, and a rusted pistol wrapped in sacking. Small things, uneven things. The tools of people denied every legal means of defense and still refusing to remain defenseless. That matters. Slave rebellions are often remembered only through the panic of their oppressors, as if the event begins when white fear begins. But the real story is usually there in the preparation. Food bundled in secret, routes measured by footsteps, old weapons hidden under work gear, women carrying supply lines under the disguise of domestic labor. The enslaved did not become organized when the first blow landed. They were organized long before, and the system feared that truth because it exposed the intelligence slavery tried to deny. Elias Reed left his row before anyone called to stop him. Not running, not wild, walking fast, cane knife still in hand, toward the line where the Morrison men waited. Around him, others did the same. A woman from the west cabins grabbed her son with one hand and a water pail with the other. 2 teenage boys pulled apart the harness rig beside the wagon shed so the horses could not be easily mounted by overseers. Nia crossed from the quarters with bandages tied under her apron and a small hatchet hidden in the folds of her skirt. Nothing about it looked theatrical. That is important to understand. Real revolt is rarely cinematic to those inside it. It is rushed, practical, improvised under pressure, filled with noise and confusion and half-finished decisions. But even inside that disorder, structure was there, Hannah Reid's structure. The one Julian Laroo had failed to see. The one he had activated by killing her. Josiah Cole emerged from behind the tool house with the old map tucked inside his shirt and Hannah's coded paper in his fist. He did not shout a speech. He gave instructions. Who moved south? Who secured the children? Who watched the road? Who stayed near the quarters? Who signaled Beaumont once the first line was crossed? That is how intelligence becomes action, not through romance, through assignment. Laroo saw it too late. He had ridden back toward the big house to press the overseer about the trader's arrival and the chain order for the morning sale. When one of the stable boys came running, breathless and half terrified, saying men were gathering near the north line, Laroo reacted the way masters often did when the enslaved ceased behaving as expected. First disbelief, then anger, then the sudden private realization that the numbers had never favored him as much as he liked to imagine. He mounted fast and rode with 2 armed whites toward the ditch, still assuming the show of force would scatter the crowd. It did not scatter. That point should be marked clearly. In the history of slavery, there are moments when fear changes direction. For years it moves downward, master to enslaved, whip to skin, gun to unarmed body, threat to silence. Then there are minutes, rare and dangerous, when the oppressed stop absorbing fear and begin returning it. That evening in October 1852, on the Laroo plantation, the current shifted. Laroo pulled his horse up and shouted for everyone to stand down. Nobody moved. He called Elias by name, perhaps thinking a husband broken by grief could still be isolated, still called out from the crowd as an individual problem. But Elias was no longer standing as an individual. That was the master's fatal misreading. Around him were men from Laroo land, Morrison, and Beaumont. Women from the kitchens and wash yards. Boys not yet grown, but old enough to carry messages and stones. Even the old were present, not because they could outrun bullets, but because history itself had shown up to witness the line being crossed. Laroo raised his pistol. One of the Morrison men lunged first. The horse reared, the shot went wide, then the field erupted. Not into chaos exactly, into collision, cane knives, axe handles, fence stakes. A single rusted pistol passed from one hand to another. Screams from the yard, hooves slipping in churned mud, white men shouting orders nobody had time to obey. A stable lantern knocked over near the shed. Smoke beginning where dry timber met carelessness and panic. This is the part white accounts usually flatten into savage frenzy. They describe mob violence, Negro madness, bloodthirsty insurrection. They prefer those phrases because the alternative is unbearable to them. That enslaved people were responding rationally to systematic murder, sale, rape, and lifelong theft. The system always criminalized black resistance to hide white criminality at its core. Laroo fell from the saddle but did not die there. That fact mattered later because survival allowed him to speak, and men like him always used survival to rewrite what happened. He would later describe himself as ambushed by an ungrateful population. He would not say that he had beaten a pregnant woman to death less than 2 days before. He would not say that he had prepared to sell her husband at dawn. He would not say that terror was the grammar of his rule long before the enslaved answered him in force. Around the quarters, the uprising widened. The storehouse was broken open first, not for plunder in the childish sense white newspapers love to imagine, but for use. Salt, rope, tools, flour, lamps. Things needed by people who understood that revolt without supply turns quickly into slaughter. Nia directed 3 women to gather what could be carried. Another group moved cabin to cabin, telling mothers which direction to go when the road opened. 2 boys from Beaumont climbed the shed roof to watch for riders coming from the parish line. Then the next wave arrived. From the river road and the cypress edge, more figures emerged in loose clusters, men from neighboring plantations, women with bundles on their backs. A few carrying hoes, clubs, butcher knives, broken farm blades, not soldiers, not an army in uniform. Something older and more dangerous to the slave order, people who had concluded that the normal condition of life was already intolerable. By sunset the count had crossed several hundred. No one had time to number exactly, but they kept coming. Word traveled faster now because the first barrier had fallen. Once it became clear that Laroo land was in motion, the neighboring enslaved understood the signal was no longer theoretical. Move now. Bring who you can. Take what matters. Do not wait for permission from a world built on your disappearance. That is how such moments grow. Not because one person commands them like a general, but because conditions ripen across many places at once, and one public crime gives everyone else a clock. By dark, the gathering had swelled toward what later survivors would describe as nearly 1,000 people in motion across the connected estates. That number frightened white Louisiana for good reason. Not because every one of those people carried a weapon. Many did not. Not because all were fighters. Some were children, elders, mothers carrying infants, men limping from old punishments. The terror lay elsewhere, in evidence. 1,000 people in motion meant the slaveholders' favorite myth had collapsed. The myth that each plantation was its own sealed world. The myth that the enslaved were too divided to coordinate. The myth that black memory could be whipped out, sold off, or buried behind the quarters. Hannah Reed, dead less than 48 hours, had disproved all of it, and here the record must correct another falsehood. What formed that night was not mere revenge, though revenge had reason enough. It was not indiscriminate destruction, though destruction followed. It was the beginning of a planned break in the machinery of captivity. Wagons carrying chain restraints were seized before they reached the yard. Men held in the punishment shed were released. A girl from Beaumont led 2 toddlers and their grandmother out through a drainage path that Hannah had marked months earlier. Josiah directed a group southward to intercept any militia rider trying to reach the parish road. Elias stayed near the center, not seeking spectacle, but trying to keep the moving mass from splitting too early. That detail matters too. The dangerous strength of the uprising was not rage alone. It was coordination inside rage. Hannah had not designed a one-night riot. She had designed a corridor, routes, signals, fallback points, food caches, shared timing. The open rising was only one phase. Beneath it was a harder truth Laroo never grasped. She had built an infrastructure of survival. By full dark, the fire near the wagon shed cast light across the yard. Faces flashed in orange and shadow. Some were determined, some terrified. Some looked almost blank because the body under extreme danger narrows itself to task. In that moving crowd were people who had never struck back before and people who had waited half a lifetime for the chance. There were those who believed they might reach freedom and those who knew they might die before dawn, but nearly all understood one thing. The old arrangement had been broken, not permanently, not yet. The white state would answer, militia would gather, blood would follow. The slave South did not surrender power because it had been exposed. It tightened its hand. But exposure matters. Once a system is shown to depend on murder and panic, no amount of official language can restore its innocence. And that night, on roads and fields stretching beyond the Laroo plantation, innocence was gone. Julian Laroo had killed a pregnant woman to make an example. Instead, by the end of October 18, 1852, her hidden network had set nearly 1,000 enslaved people into motion. That was the true scandal. Not that the enslaved rose. That they had been planning, remembering, linking, and preparing all along. By the night of October 19, 1852, the uprising had become large enough to frighten every white household within riding distance, and that was precisely when it became most vulnerable. That is the pattern the record keeps repeating. When enslaved people move in small numbers, the slave state mocks them as scattered runaways. When they move in hundreds, the same state suddenly discovers urgency, law, patrol power, militia discipline, and righteous language. White Louisiana did not panic because it valued life. It panicked because property had begun to disobey. And when property disobeyed, the full machinery of punishment moved quickly. By then, the people gathered out beyond the Laroo fields had already left behind the fantasy of an easy victory. The first break had succeeded. Supply sheds had been opened. Prisoners had been freed. Routes between the Laroo, Morrison, and Beaumont plantations had been joined. Women and children had been pushed toward safer paths. Men with tools and stolen pistols had formed loose outer lines. In raw numbers, the movement had swelled toward 1,000 people in motion across the plantation district. But numbers alone are not security. Not in slave country. A mass of the enslaved on the move carried its own weaknesses. Too many hungry mouths, too many frightened children, too many wounded, too many people with courage but no weapons equal to militia guns. Hannah Reed had understood this. That is why her system had not been built merely for spectacle or revenge. It had been built around phases: signal, movement, supply, separation, retreat, shelter. The open rising was only one part of the design. The rest depended on discipline, and discipline is easiest to break when fear and hope rise together. They made camp that night near a low wooded tract beyond the cane, between the old road and marshy ground that could slow mounted pursuit. Fires were kept small at first, then larger than they should have been, because people were exhausted, and because exhaustion always loosens caution. Some believed more fighters would still arrive by dawn. Some believed the nearest militias had not yet organized. Some believed Julian Laroo's fall from his horse had broken the will of the planters. That was a dangerous belief. White power under slavery did not break because one master bled. It consolidated. Josiah Cole knew it. Age had taught him what youth sometimes refuses to hear. He walked the camp with his bad leg and warned the inner circle that the white response would come before sunrise or not long after. Riders would have reached the parish line. Plantation sons, eager for glory, would join local patrols. Deputies, overseers, merchants, and idle white men who called themselves protectors of civilization would suddenly become soldiers once black people moved in numbers. Nothing united the white South faster than the fear of losing control over enslaved labor. That is another truth the moral record should keep plain. Slavery's defenders spoke often of order, Christianity, and social peace. Yet the instant black people sought freedom, those same defenders became an armed mob with legal cover. Elias Reed heard Josiah, but that night he also heard other voices. Men from Morrison arguing that they should strike the parish road at once before militias gathered. A group from Beaumont insisting the camp needed to move deeper south toward the waterways. Women asking where the children would sleep if they marched again before dawn. Younger men, flushed by the first success, speaking of taking horses and driving straight through the district while fear was still fresh. Hunger sharpened tempers. Grief sharpened them further. Hannah had been dead only 2 days. For many, rage still outran strategy. Then the stranger stepped closer to the center fire. In this telling, his name is Ben Crow. He had joined near dusk with a cluster from a smaller tract west of the Morrison line. He carried himself like a man already frightened before the real danger began, too eager to help, too quick to ask who was in command, too attentive to the layout of the camp. Men like him exist in every violent system, not because they are uniquely monstrous, but because terror rearranges weak souls until self-preservation becomes their only god. Ben asked where the outer watch was posted. He asked how many pistols had been taken. He asked whether the road south or the marsh path east would be used at dawn. Too many questions. Nia saw it first. That matters too. The historical eye is often trained to look for male suspicion, male command, male recognition of threat. But women under slavery were forced to read danger constantly. Facial changes, hesitations, tonal shifts, lies disguised as politeness. Nia had spent years surviving in kitchens and yards where white moods could kill. She knew the smell of false loyalty. She told Elias quietly that the man was wrong, not proven, wrong, but suspicion in a camp like that could not be handled carelessly. Accuse the wrong man and panic spreads inward. Say nothing, and the wrong man might carry the whole night out of the camp and into the hands of militia. Josiah split the difference. He moved Ben to the western edge with a small watch detail, away from the inner circle and away from Hannah's papers, which Elias kept wrapped inside his shirt. It was a sound decision, but not sound enough. Because once betrayal enters a struggle like this, it does not always need access to every secret. It only needs enough, and enough had already been seen. The camp's rough shape, the weak northern side, the number of children clustered near the wagons. The fact that many fighters held farm tools, not firearms. The fact that exhaustion had slowed rotation on the perimeter. That was enough. Sometime after midnight, Ben Crow slipped away. No dramatic chase. No shouted alarm, just absence, which is often how catastrophe begins. He crossed the low field west of camp and reached a mounted patrol before dawn. There he gave them what white authorities always wanted most, not merely proof of black movement, but internal detail. He told them where the fires were. He told them how many seemed armed. He told them the old man with the stiff leg appeared to be giving orders. He told them women and children were mixed into the center, making the crowd slower than it looked. And with that, the uprising size became its weakness. The militia force that formed against them was not heroic. It was typical: parish riders, overseers, hired whites, planter sons. Men who would later talk about defending home and civilization, though what they were truly defending was ownership, the supposed right to command black bodies forever and to kill those who resisted. They moved before dawn on October 20th, 1852, approaching from more than one side because betrayal had taught them exactly how the camp lay. The first shots came out of darkness. That detail should remain sharp, not a fair fight. Not lined men meeting in daylight with equal arms. Shots into a sleeping or half-waking camp crowded with fugitives, mothers, wounded, elders, and men who had spent 2 days running on fury and little food. The northern edge broke first. A boy on watch was hit before he finished shouting. Horses crashed through brush. White voices yelled to surround the tree line and cut off the marsh path. People stumbled out of blankets and grass hollows reaching for tools, children, one another. Firelight became a curse now, illuminating bodies for armed men outside the ring. Elias grabbed the nearest child and shoved him toward Nia. Josiah was already upright, dragging one wounded man behind a wagon while shouting for the eastern side to move. Women threw dirt over one fire to darken the center. A Morrison fighter fired the stolen pistol once, maybe twice, before a second shot from the militia dropped him backward into the mud. This is where history often loses the vulnerable. It counts fighters, dead whites, captured leaders. It forgets the mothers crouched over infants in wet ground. It forgets the old man who cannot run, but still stands to slow the shooters. It forgets the girl carrying water who turns into a medic because blood is everywhere. Those people belong in the record too, not as background, as the truth of what repression actually strikes first. The camp did not collapse because the people were cowards. It collapsed because they had been betrayed and outgunned. That distinction is moral as much as factual. Slave uprisings are too often remembered only by their failure, as if failure proves they were doomed by foolishness. No. Many were broken by overwhelming force deployed against people who had every reason to resist, and almost no legal or material chance to survive the response. Josiah tried to hold the center long enough for the children to move. He used no grand speech. He simply planted himself where the eastern line narrowed and directed bodies through the opening while the shooting closed in. Elias saw him strike one mounted man with a cane blade across the arm. Saw him pull a teenage girl clear of a falling mule. Saw him turn back when he should have fled because old rebels know something the young learn too late. Somebody must buy time with his own body. Then they took him. 3 militiamen hit him at once near the wagon axle. One with a club, one with the butt of a gun, one wrenching his arms behind him while he was still half standing. Elias started toward him and nearly died for it. Nia caught his sleeve and pulled him down as another shot tore through the smoke where his chest had been a second earlier. Josiah was captured alive. That single fact spread terror faster than the gunfire, because a captured elder did not just mean one more prisoner. It meant memory seized. It meant white men would demand names, routes, leaders, intentions. It meant spectacle punishment later if they chose to make an example of him. The slave South loved examples. By first light, the camp was shattered. Not erased. Shattered. Families split in different directions. Some fighters fled toward the cypress line. Some were cut down in the open ground. Several women got children into the reeds. A handful of Morrison men dragged the wounded south. The crowd that had once swelled toward 1,000 was now broken into frightened fragments, scattered by betrayal and lead. And in the mud of that ruined dawn, the old promise of the plantation returned in its ugliest form. Not merely domination, but demonstration. White power wanted every survivor to see what happened to organized black resistance. It wanted them to carry the lesson back into every cabin and field. But lessons do not belong only to the oppressor. Another lesson remained too. Hannah Reed had built for collapse as well as uprising, and the people who still carried her map were not finished yet. By the morning of October 20th, 1852, the uprising was no longer a single force. It was a scattering of survivors moving through mud, cane, and marsh with the slave state at their backs. That is how white power preferred it. It feared organized black resistance, but it understood how to punish fragments. Break the camp. Separate the families. Capture an elder. Drive the wounded into swampland. Then let hunger, exhaustion, and terror complete what militia bullets began. This was not merely repression. It was method. Louisiana had practiced it for generations. Plantation society knew that once the enslaved were forced out of formation, the land itself could be turned into an accomplice. Water, snakes, mud, distance, darkness, fever. Nature was recruited into slavery whenever white men found it useful. Elias Reed, Naya, and fewer than 40 others reached the low marsh east of the broken camp shortly after sunrise. They did not arrive as victors. They arrived carrying what the white record always tried to hide, the physical cost of black resistance. A boy with blood soaking through a torn shirt. A woman who had lost one child in the dark and still had another tied to her back. A man from Morrison with a shattered hand wrapped in mud-streaked cloth. 2 girls barefoot in swamp water, silent with shock. Elias himself moving like a man whose body had not yet caught up to his grief. That detail matters, because rebellion is often retold from the moment of attack, the shout, the fire, the numbers. But the more honest record includes the retreat. The limp, the hunger, the decision not to lie down and die even when the body has already been overdrawn. Nia took count as best she could, not of weapons. Of living people, 37 at first. Then 41 after 2 more families emerged from the reeds and a wounded Beaumont man crawled in after them. No sign of Josiah Cole. No sign of most of the outer line. No sign of the children taken west when the first shots tore through camp. The uprising that had swelled toward 1,000 souls across connected plantations had now narrowed into a marsh-bound remnant small enough for white men to call broken. But white men often mistake survival for surrender. Elias wanted to turn back. That is not weakness. It is what husbands, sons, and comrades say when the people they love have been captured. Josiah was alive when they took him. Others might still be alive too. Under any decent order, rescue would have been a moral certainty. But slavery had poisoned even morality with arithmetic. If Elias led the survivors back too soon, they would not rescue the captured. They would feed more bodies into the militia line. Nia stopped him, not with gentleness, with fact. Josiah had known the risk when he stayed at the center. Hannah had known the risk when she built the network. Neither of them had been working for one man's grief. They had been working for continuity, for the possibility that even after a crushed rising, somebody would still carry roots, names, and methods beyond the reach of the plantation. That is the difference between a riot and infrastructure. Elias finally took Hannah's papers from inside his shirt and unfolded the last sheet fully for the first time. There, in tighter handwriting and smaller marks than the rest, was the portion she had hidden deepest. Not the contact chains between plantations, not the supply symbols. The contingency line, a drawn route through the eastern wetlands, 2 crossed reeds for shallow passage, 3 dots near a crescent for safe footing under cypress cover, a word Hannah had written only once, as if even on paper she did not trust it to appear often. Refuge, below it, another name, not Laroo, not Morrison, not anyone tied to the plantation belt. Maman Sabine. This is where the story exposes another white lie. Slave society loved to imagine the swamp as emptiness, as waste ground, as a place where only animals and fugitives without hope disappeared. But black people in Louisiana knew better. The marsh held histories the plantation could not fully police. Maroon camps, hidden fishing settlements, kin networks surviving beyond formal maps. People who traded in silence, moved at night, and knew which channels belonged to water and which belonged to death. Hannah Reed had built toward them long before Julian Laroo ever raised his hand against her. That is the true scale of her work. Not merely planning an outbreak on a few plantations, but establishing a second line beyond failure. She had assumed that open revolt might be crushed. She had assumed betrayal was possible. She had assumed the white state would answer faster and harder than hope wanted to admit. And because she understood slavery as a system rather than a series of isolated cruelties, she planned systemically in return. The survivors moved east by noon. No road, no wagon path, just the route Hannah had marked in miniature, trusting that the right people would know how to read what white eyes would dismiss as scratches. They moved in single file where the water rose. Children were carried in turn. Nia kept the wounded man with the broken hand from dropping into the deeper cut near a fallen cypress. Elias walked near the rear for a time, then near the front, unable to settle because leadership in defeat does not feel like command. It feels like debt. Behind them, somewhere beyond the reeds, the militia was still combing for fugitives. You can hear that in the historical silence. Not because the men hunting them wrote down every step. They rarely bothered to document the chase unless it ended in capture. But the structure of slavery tells the rest. White posses did not break a rebel camp at dawn and then politely stop. They pursued. They used dogs when they could. They watched ferry points. They questioned poor whites, free blacks, fishermen, traders. They stretched the landscape into a net. That was how a slave state behaved when frightened. By late afternoon, the first of the survivors began to fail physically. A child fainted from hunger. The Beaumont man with the broken hand developed a feverish shiver. One elderly woman could no longer lift her feet high enough through the waterlogged roots. Every pause risked detection. Every push forward risked collapse. This is where noble language becomes dishonest. Survival under those conditions was ugly, wet, painful work. The body had to be dragged through history. At sunset, they reached a rise barely visible beneath hanging moss. Two figures stepped out with muskets already aimed. That was not a rescue scene. It was a test. The first man asked no name. He asked for the sign. Elias did not know it. Naya did. She bent, broke a reed with her left hand, and placed it across her right wrist exactly as Hannah's tiny mark had shown. Then she said the phrase written on the back edge of the hidden sheet. Water remembers what chains forget. Only then did the muskets lower. The settlement beyond the rise was not large, perhaps a few cabins half sunk into the cypress margin, platforms lashed from wood and salvaged plank, fish racks, hidden canoes, a smoke pit banked so low it gave almost nothing to the sky. But size was not the point. Its existence was the point. A black settlement outside plantation law, surviving in the wetlands by skill, secrecy, exchange, and refusal. This is where Maman Sabine entered the record. Older than Elias expected, scar across one side of the face. Eyes that measured before they welcomed. She did not react theatrically to Hannah's name. She closed her eyes once, as if confirming what she had feared would someday happen. Then she told them what Hannah had arranged, not in one meeting. Over years, medicine traded for fish and dried meat, messages carried through midwives and boatmen, a promise that if the plantation network ever shattered, survivors would be directed east. Hannah had not simply heard rumors of a maroon refuge. She had invested in it, fed it, bound it into her larger design. She had understood that freedom in enslaved Louisiana could not depend on one spectacular victory. It required fallback ground. Storage. People accustomed to hiding communities in plain geography. This was not sentiment. It was statecraft under captivity. That is why Julian Laroo had already lost in a deeper sense than he knew. He could kill Hannah Reed's body. He could trigger militia reprisals. He could help break the first open rising. But he could not reach backward through time and undo the years she had spent building connections beyond his horizon. The plantation only ruled what it could see. Hannah had worked in the spaces it could not. That night in the marsh settlement, the survivors were fed in silence first. Corn mash, fish broth, bitter herbs for fever, cloth for wounds, a place to lay the children under cover. The practical mercy of people who understood that rescue begins with the stomach and the bleeding, not speeches. Elias ate without tasting. He was still hearing the camp break, still seeing Josiah taken alive. Maman Sabine let him carry that for a while. Then she brought him a second packet sealed in waxed cloth. Hannah left this before summer ended, she said. Inside was another map, cleaner than the others, reaching beyond the marsh, not north toward some distant fantasy, but laterally through the plantation belt itself. Hidden landings. Cabin marks, a church cellar, a fisherman's skiff route, even a notation for where patrols grew lazy after heavy rain. This was no longer a revolt diagram. It was a corridor, an underground line from plantation terror to wetland refuge, from wetland refuge to safer passage, built not for one night of vengeance, but for repeated use. Nia saw it immediately. So did Elias, though slower, because grief still narrows the mind to what was lost. Hannah had built something that could outlive the failed camp. Something quieter, harder to crush, less glorious to history books perhaps, but more dangerous to slavery over time. A system that could keep taking people away from the plantations. That is often how the oppressed survive the first defeat. Not by pretending defeat did not happen, but by changing the shape of struggle. Open formation gives way to hidden corridor. Public uprising gives way to extraction, shelter, return. A broken army becomes a moving network. Before midnight, while the marsh insects screamed in the dark and the wounded slept badly around low coals, Elias finally understood the full indictment Hannah had left behind. Julian Laroo thought her greatest threat was what she might say, but her greatest threat was what she had already built. And in the drowned margins of Louisiana, on October 20th, 1852, That structure was still alive. By the last week of October 1852, white Louisiana believed the danger had been contained. That belief was premature. Worse than premature, it was self-protective fiction. The militia had broken the camp. The newspapers that bothered to mention the violence would frame it as a suppressed slave disturbance. Planters in nearby parishes reassured one another that swift force had restored order. Men like Julian Laroo, bruised but alive, relied on the old grammar of slave society: punish publicly, recapture quickly, hang a few, sell the rest, and call the future secure. But secure for whom? Not for the enslaved, certainly. And not even, in the long run, for the men who claimed to own them. Because once a system is forced to show its full face, murder, sale, militia raids, informants, collective punishment, it may regain temporary control, but it loses the right to call itself natural. It stands exposed, and exposure changes what people are willing to risk. That is where the story of Hannah Reed widened after her death. In the marsh settlement east of the plantation belt, Elias Reed spent 2 days learning what Hannah had prepared without ever having the luxury to explain it to him. The map Maman Sabine gave him was not symbolic. It was operational. Every mark on it represented labor already done: a skiff hidden under cane poles, a fisherman willing to take fugitives one stretch at a time, a church cellar where a black sexton could hide 2 people for a night, a widow's smokehouse used as a food cache, a ditch route between fields that patrol riders avoided in wet weather. This was not the remains of a failed uprising. It was the skeleton of a survival corridor. That distinction matters. White authority always preferred black resistance in forms it could see and crush: an armed camp in open ground, a burning shed, a crowd on the road. Those could be surrounded, shot into fragments, then used as warnings. But a corridor was harder. A corridor moved under notice. A corridor depended on many hands, each carrying only part of the whole. A corridor did not need glory, it needed repetition. Hannah had planned for repetition. That is why the final judgment on Julian Laroo cannot rest only on what he did in the yard, when he beat a pregnant woman to death. The deeper judgment is this: he believed violence could end a threat that had already passed beyond his property line. He thought in terms of ownership. Hannah had moved beyond ownership into network. He ruled one plantation. She had stitched together roots through an entire district. Maman Sabine laid out the next step without ceremony. If they stayed hidden too long, the militia sweeps would widen and food would thin. If they moved too quickly without striking back, the captured would disappear into jail cells, punishment sheds, and auction lines. So the survivors would do what Hannah's papers had anticipated after a broken rising: divide into 2 functions. One line would open the corridor, the other would retrieve who they still could. Again, this is where the record should correct the plantation version of events. White sources often treat slave resistance as pure destruction, blind and immediate. But here the logic was precise. Rescue was not just emotional, it was strategic. Every living prisoner who knew roots or names was a target for torture, coercion, or exemplary killing. Every child left behind in the chaos could be sold off before the month ended. Retrieval was not separate from survival. It was survival. On the night of October 24th, 1852, Elias left the marsh with a small return party. Not a large force. That would have repeated the mistake of visibility. Just 7 people besides him. Nia, 2 marshmen who knew the eastern creeks, a Beaumont woman whose younger sister had been taken in the Dawn raid, a fisherman with a shotgun too old to trust twice, and 2 young runners who could move quickly between points without drawing attention. They carried no banner, no declaration, no illusion that justice would suddenly emerge from the parish courthouse. What they carried was knowledge of the ground and Hannah's map folded in oilcloth. Their first target was not Laroo's house. That surprises people raised on dramatic revenge stories. But Hannah's design was colder and more intelligent than revenge alone. Strike the jail cart route first. Intercept movement, not symbols. Seize the bodies before the slave system could process them into disappearance. The cart left from a holding shed near the old river crossing after daybreak, taking prisoners toward parish authority and, after that, toward whatever punishment or sale white officials considered useful. Hannah had marked the crossing months earlier as vulnerable in heavy rain. The ground narrowed, wheels stuck, mounted guards slowed. Rain had come on the 23rd. That small fact mattered more than speeches. At dawn on the 24th, the rescue party lay in wet brush near the crossing while the cart creaked into the choke point exactly where Hannah's notations suggested it would drag. One guard dismounted to free a wheel. The second circled too wide, watching the tree line and missing the ditch on his blind side. Elias moved first. Not wildly, fast, a club to the nearest man's arm before he could raise the gun. Naya at the rear horse, slashing the lead strap so the animal twisted the harness out of line. The fisherman fired once and the sound rolled over the water like a signal from an older war. Inside the cart were 4 prisoners, not Josiah, 2 men from Morrison, the Beaumont woman's sister, and a boy of 15 from Laroo land with one eye swollen shut from beating. Alive, shackled, terrified. That should be counted as more than a small victory. Under slavery, every body pulled back from the machinery mattered. Every person removed from sail, whipping post, or gallows altered the moral balance, even if only by inches. The institution depended on converting people into examples. Rescuing them interrupted the lesson. They cut the chains, took the guards' powder, and vanished before the larger patrol line could converge. That same week, a second team guided 3 mothers and 5 children out through the corridor's northern branch. Then another pair moved an injured mill worker from a hidden loft near Morrison to a boat landing farther east. Then a church sexton opened the cellar beneath his small black congregation for one night, then another, while patrols searched above ground for runaways they imagined still trapped in the plantation zone. This is how failed revolts become durable resistance. Not by pretending the camp was never broken. It was broken. People died. People were captured. Josiah Cole remained in white hands. Some families were split and never fully restored. A truthful account must not cheat the dead by polishing catastrophe into neat victory. But neither should it accept the master's verdict. Because by the end of October 1852, the uprising had changed form rather than ended. The visible crowd had been shattered. The hidden corridor had activated. Plantation power still stood, yes, but with a breach running beneath it. Men and women were now leaving through routes Hannah Reed had prepared. Food and medicine were being transferred outside the master's sight. Names once trapped on specific estates were becoming harder to hold in place. The district no longer functioned as a closed system. That was the real damage. Julian Laroo learned this the slow way, through absence. A mother and 2 boys missing from the west cabins, a stable hand gone after rain, a field woman not found during the next inventory. A teenager last seen near the ditch line, then another, and another, each disappearance small enough to explain away if he wished to lie to himself, but together they formed a pattern no ledger could comfort him against. Property was leaking, and not leaking at random, through design. He responded as masters did, more patrols. More restrictions on movement after dark, more questioning, more punishment against anyone suspected of carrying messages. But repression has limits when it begins too late. Every added search proved fear. Every new rule confirmed that the plantation had lost the ease it once performed. Laroo could still beat bodies. He could still threaten sales. He could still summon armed white men. But he could not unknow what Hannah had revealed, that his power depended on total visibility, and total visibility had been broken. As for Josiah, word reached the marsh by early November 1852 that he was being held under guard, badly beaten, expected to name names. He gave them nothing useful. That belongs in the record as well. Old rebels are often remembered only when they die dramatically, but endurance under interrogation is its own form of battle. He had carried memory from 1811 into 1852, then carried silence when white men tried to force memory open. Whether he lived many weeks beyond that or not, the moral shape of his role was already complete. He bought time twice, first with his body at the broken camp, then with his silence afterward. By mid-November, the corridor had already moved more than 24 people out of immediate plantation reach. Not north to some easy myth of freedom. Not all the way beyond danger, that would come later for some and never for others, but out of the first ring of ownership, out of the reach of quick sale, out of Laroo's hand. And that is where the final twist must be stated plainly. Julian Laroo thought he had killed Hannah Reed to silence a defiant woman and terrify the others back into obedience. He did not understand that she had already built the thing that mattered most, not a speech, not a moment. Not even the uprising alone, a structure, a route by which the enslaved could continue leaving the world he ruled. That is why his violence backfired in a way deeper than wounded pride or burned property. By murdering Hannah in public in October 1852, he did not end her work. He announced its necessity to everyone who witnessed it. He pushed the network from secrecy into motion. He turned a hidden design into a living breach. He made the plantation reveal that it could only govern by spectacle and blood, and once that truth was fully seen, more people were willing to risk the corridor she had left behind. The master thought the dead woman was the warning. He never understood she was the architect, and so the record should close with the lesson placed where it belongs, not on his authority, on her foresight, not on the plantation's order. On the people who broke through it, not on what white Louisiana claimed it restored, on what it could no longer contain. If this story reached you tonight, subscribe, comment your location below, and tell me your theory. Did Julian Laroo destroy his own power the moment he killed Hannah, or had her rebellion already become unstoppable long before that morning?